The soft, rhythmic scratching of a quill against parchment is a sound that has echoed through the centuries, a quiet testament to the human desire to capture the world on a single, flat surface. In the year 1929, within the dust-moated silence of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, a theologian named Gustav Deissmann was cataloguing the imperial library when he pulled a bundle of discarded materials from a shelf. Among the stacks of forgotten ledgers and faded scrolls, he discovered a fragment of gazelle skin, a piece of parchment that had survived the collapse of empires and the slow decay of time. It was not particularly large, yet as he smoothed the crinkled edges, the vibrant colours seemed to glow with an unnatural freshness, as if the ink had only just dried. Deep ochres, rich indigos, and delicate washes of gold traced the outlines of a world that shouldn't have existed in the mind of a 16th century sailor. This was a portion of a world map dated to the year 1513 and signed by the Ottoman admiral and cartographer Piri Reis. As Deissmann looked closer, the intricate Ottoman calligraphy dancing across the margins spoke of lost sources and ancient charts. The map was a tapestry of information, a compilation of 20 different source maps, some of which Piri Reis claimed dated back to the time of Alexander the Great. The craftsmanship was exquisite, featuring detailed depictions of ships, mythical beasts, and mountain ranges, all rendered with a precision that felt out of place for its era. But it was the geography itself that caused the air in the room to turn cold. There, stretching across the Atlantic, was a recognizable outline of South America, and further south, a landmass that seemed to defy the very laws of history. It was a coastline that appeared to be Antarctica, yet it was drawn with a startling clarity, showing bays, rivers, and mountain peaks that have been buried under 2 miles of solid ice for thousands of years. The discovery sent a ripple through the quiet halls of academia, a gentle disturbance that would eventually grow into a storm of questions about the true age of human civilization. We are often told that the history of our world is a linear progression, a steady climb from the primitive to the sophisticated, yet the Piri Reis map suggests a different story. It hints at a time when the oceans were not barriers, but highways, and when unknown voyagers possessed a knowledge of the globe that we are only now beginning to rediscover. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day drift away, you are in the right place to explore these forgotten corridors of time. Here at the Slumber Archives, we share new history narrations just like this one every single day, weaving together the mysteries of the past to help you find a peaceful night's rest. If you find these journeys into the unknown relaxing, you might consider subscribing so you never miss a new story. A gentle like on the video also helps others find their way to our quiet corner of the world. Now, let us return to the mystery of the parchment and the secrets it holds. The map depicts the coast of Brazil and the mountains of the Andes with a fidelity that seems impossible for the early 16th century. At that time, the interior of the Americas was largely a blank space on European charts, a terra incognita shrouded in myth and shadow. Yet Piri Reis had captured the curvature of the coast and the placement of islands with an accuracy that suggests he was looking at something far older than the accounts of Christopher Columbus. The most haunting feature, however, lies at the very bottom of the fragment. There, the coastline of South America seems to curve eastward, merging into a landmass that many researchers believe represents the Queen Maud Land coast of Antarctica. In modern times, we know this region as a desolate wasteland of white, a place where the ice never melts and the wind howls across a frozen void. But on the Piri Reis map, this southern land is depicted without its icy shroud. It shows the subglacial topography, the actual shape of the earth beneath the glaciers. To see this coastline as it appears on the map, one would have to look back through the lens of deep time to a period long before the rise of the first known dynasties of Egypt or Sumer. This brings us to the concept of the Younger Dryas, a term used in stratigraphy, which is simply the study of rock layers, to describe a period of abrupt and cataclysmic climate change roughly 12,800 years ago. Mainstream science tells us that Antarctica has been covered in ice for millions of years, yet the Piri Reis map stands as a silent, parchment witness to a different possibility. It suggests that someone, in a forgotten epoch of human history, sailed those southern waters when they were still liquid and blue. Someone mapped the bays where the ice now sits hundreds of feet thick. As we look at the elegant curves of the Ottoman ink, we have to ask ourselves if our ancestors were far more capable than we give them credit for. Perhaps there was a global maritime culture that flourished in the twilight of the last ice age, a civilization that understood the stars and the sea with a precision that was later lost to the rising tides and the shifting crust of the earth. The map is not just a piece of navigation, it is a ghost. It is a remnant of a library that no longer exists, a shadow cast by a sun that set thousands of years ago. Piri Reis himself was a man of great intellect and high standing in the Ottoman navy, eventually meeting a tragic end when he was executed in Cairo in 1553. He did not claim to have discovered these lands himself. Instead, he wrote that he was a mere compiler, a keeper of secrets who had rescued these ancient geometries from the ravages of time. He spoke of the infidel Christopher and his voyages, but he also spoke of maps from the time of Alexander, charts that had been preserved in the great centres of learning before they were scattered to the winds. Imagine the silence of that palace library in 1929, the smell of old dust and the soft light filtering through the arched windows. As the scholars pored over the gazelle's skin, they were looking at a puzzle that refused to be solved. If the map is accurate, it implies that the art of cartography was perfected long before the invention of the telescope or the chronometer. It implies a level of mathematical sophistication that shouldn't have existed. We are left to wonder about the limits of what we know, and how much of our history has been erased by the slow, grinding movement of the glaciers and the relentless rise of the oceans. The Piri Reis map invites us to step away from the certainty of the present and to drift into the possibilities of the past. It asks us to consider the earth not as a static thing, but as a changing, breathing entity that has seen civilizations rise and fall like the tides. The vibrant blues and reds of the map are a reminder that the world was once vibrant and known to eyes that we can no longer see. As the night grows deeper and the world outside falls silent, we begin our journey into these maritime secrets, travelling back through the centuries to a time when the maps were still being drawn and the great southern continent was a land of green and stone, waiting for the ice to come. There is a certain comfort in the mystery, a feeling of being small in the face of such vast reaches of time. The map is a bridge, a fragile link between our world and a world that has been forgotten. It whispers of lost voyages, of sailors who navigated by the position of the stars and the taste of the salt spray long before the first pyramids were ever conceived. And so we let the questions linger, not as problems to be solved, but as stories to be told in the quiet hours of the night. The parchment remains, a silent guardian of a history we are only just beginning to remember. The smell of old parchment is often described as a mixture of vanilla and dried grass, a scent born from the slow decay of organic fibres over hundreds of years. It is the aroma of time itself, trapped in the weave of animal skin and ink. To understand the map that challenges our history, we must first understand the man whose hands once pressed against that very vellum, a man who lived at the intersection of two worlds. Ahmed Muhiddin Piri, the man the world would come to know as Piri Reis, did not begin his life in a quiet library or a scholar's study. His classroom was the deck of a galley, and his teachers were the shifting winds of the Mediterranean and the rhythmic creak of timber against the waves. Born in the mid-15th century in the coastal town of Gallipoli, his early years were defined by the horizon. He was the nephew of Piri Reis, one of the most feared and respected privateers of the age. In those days, the line between a pirate and a naval officer was as thin as a coastal mist, and young Piri spent his formative years as a corsair, learning the secret language of the sea under his uncle's watchful eye. Imagine a young man standing at the prow of a ship, watching the sun dip below the jagged cliffs of the North African coast. He is not merely looking for merchant vessels or safe harbours, he is observing the way the water changes colour over a hidden reef, the way the birds fly toward land before a storm, and the specific shape of a headland that no map has yet captured correctly. This was an education of the senses. Between 1481 and 1491, Piri participated in countless naval engagements, but even then, amidst the smoke of cannons and the chaos of boarding parties, he was a collector of information. He was gathering the fragments of a world that was rapidly expanding, a world where the edges of the known were being pushed further back with every passing season. As the years passed, the privateer transitioned into a pillar of the Ottoman state. The Ottoman Empire at this time was more than just a military power. It was a vast, breathing bridge between the mysterious East and the awakening West. From the vantage point of Constantinople, the sultans looked out upon a world where the Silk Roads met the spice routes, and where the wisdom of ancient Greece and Persia was being rediscovered and synthesized with Islamic science. Piri Reis rose through the ranks to become an admiral, a great race, but his mind remained that of a cartographer, a seeker of patterns in the vastness of the blue. There is a certain stillness that comes with great responsibility, and as an admiral in the Ottoman navy, Piri found himself in possession of resources that few others could claim. He had access to the imperial library, a repository of knowledge that had survived the rise and fall of empires. It is here, in the quiet corridors of power, that the scholar within the sailor began to emerge. He began to compile his life's work, the Kitab-ı-Bahriye, or the Book of the Sea. This was not just a collection of maps, but a masterpiece of navigation and geography, containing detailed instructions on currents, ports, and the hidden dangers of the Mediterranean. It was a practical guide, yes, but it was also a philosophical statement, a testament to the idea that the world could be understood, measured and drawn. But Piri Reis was looking beyond the Mediterranean. He was obsessed with the stories brought back by sailors who had ventured into the Sea of Darkness, the Atlantic Ocean. He began to collect maps like others might collect gold or precious gems. He sought out Portuguese charts, Arabic manuscripts, and, most intriguingly, maps that were rumoured to have belonged to Christopher Columbus himself. He was a weaver of threads, pulling together disparate strands of human experience to create a single, unified picture of the earth. As we consider his life, we must realize that Piri lived in a moment of profound cultural synthesis. The Ottoman Empire was the guardian of the old world's secrets. While Europe was just beginning to emerge from its own medieval slumber, the scholars of the East had been preserving the works of Ptolemy and the geographers of Alexandria for centuries. Piri Reis stood at the center of this exchange. He was a man who could speak the language of the hardened sailor and the refined courtier alike. He understood that a map was more than a tool for conquest. It was a record of human memory. When he sat down in Gallipoli in 1513 to draft his famous world map, he was not merely drawing what he had seen. He was performing an act of deep synthesis. He tells us in his own writings that he consulted 20 different maps to create his own. 8 of these were Ptolemaic maps, documents that traced their lineage back to the 2nd century, to the great library of Alexandria. These maps represented a time when the world was viewed through a different lens, perhaps preserving echoes of a maritime tradition that was already ancient when the Romans were still in their infancy. Think of the patience required for such a task, the flickering light of a lamp casting long shadows across the room, as Piri compares a Portuguese chart of the Brazilian coast with an ancient Arabic map of the stars. He is looking for the points where they align, the places where the modern observer and the ancient mariner saw the same truth. He is navigating through time as much as through space. There is a weight to this kind of work, a sense of being a steward for something far larger than oneself. And yet, there is a mystery that lingers in the ink. If Piri Reis was a meticulous scholar, a man who valued accuracy and the testimony of reliable sources, why does his map show things that should have been impossible to know? Why does the coastline of South America continue down, curving into a landmass that looks hauntingly like the coast of Antarctica, not as it appears today, buried under miles of ice, but as it might have appeared when the land was bare? To explain this, some might point to the limits of 17th century surveying, suggesting it was merely a lucky guess or a distortion of the coastline. But Piri was an admiral. He knew the cost of a bad map. He knew that a single error could lead a fleet to its doom. His life was dedicated to the pursuit of geographical truth. If he included that landmass, it was because he believed his sources were valid. And if his sources were valid, we are forced to confront a staggering possibility that Piri's map is a copy of a copy, a fragment of a much older tradition of seafaring that dates back into the depths of the last ice age. This brings us to the concept of deep time, a scale of history that dwarfs our written records. We often think of civilization as a steady climb, a linear progression from the primitive to the advanced, but the map of Piri Reis suggests a different story, a story of cycles, of peaks and valleys, of great heights reached and then forgotten. It hints at a period before the great glaciers claimed the southern continent, a time when the world was mapped by a civilization whose name has been lost to the winds. In the quiet of the night, as we look at the faded colours of the Piri Reis map, we see more than just geography. We see the reflection of a man who lived between the known and the unknown. Piri Reis was a bridge. He bridged the gap between the privateer and the admiral, between the east and the west, and perhaps, without even knowing it, he bridged the gap between our modern world and a lost epoch of human history. He was a man of his time, but his work carries the echoes of a time that defies explanation. As he laboured over his desk in Gallipoli, the world outside was changing. The oceans were becoming highways for trade and war, but inside his study, the admiral was looking backward, reaching into the darkness of the past to find a light that could guide the future. He did not know that his map would one day be found in a dusty corner of the Topkapi Palace, or that it would spark a fire of curiosity that burns to this day. He only knew that the world was vast, and that every line he drew was a prayer against forgetting. The parchment is old, and the ink is dry, but the story of Piri Reis remains a testament to the enduring human desire to map the shadows. He reminds us that even in an age of exploration, there are still mysteries that lie just beyond the reach of our lanterns, waiting for us to find the courage to look again. And so, we continue our journey into the map, following the lines of the coast into the cold, silent regions of the south, where the ice begins to whisper its own secrets. To understand the image Piri Reis left behind, we must first look at the hands that held the pen, and more importantly, the tattered, yellowed fragments that lay scattered across his desk in the year 1513. He was not merely a sailor or a warrior, but a weaver of worlds, a man who sat in the quiet of his study in Gallipoli, surrounded by the scent of old vellum and the salt air drifting in from the Dardanelles. In the margins of his great map, written in the elegant, flowing script of Ottoman Turkish, Piri Reis leaves us a confession of sorts, a breadcrumb trail leading back into the labyrinth of history. He tells us quite clearly that he did not sail to these distant shores himself to measure the tides or the bend of the coast. Instead, he admits to being a collector of ghosts, synthesizing his masterwork from no fewer than 20 different source maps, some of which were contemporary to his era, while others were already ancient, even then. As he worked, the admiral was performing a feat of intellectual alchemy, attempting to harmonize voices from across the centuries into a single, cohesive vision of the Earth. Among these 20 sources, he specifically mentions 8 Ptolemaic maps, documents whose lineage stretches back to the 2nd century and the Great Library of Alexandria. These are maps born of a time when the world was understood through the lens of geometry and the stars, yet they carried within them the echoes of even older, lost surveys. One can almost see him, leaning close to the parchment by the flickering light of a lamp, comparing the curves of a coastline drawn by a Greek scholar 1,000 years dead, with the fresh, ink-stained charts of 4 Portuguese sailors who had only recently returned from the churning waters of the Atlantic. The technical challenge he faced was immense, for these maps did not speak the same language of measurement. Some used the Portolan style, crisscrossed with rhumb lines that radiated out like the silk of a spider's web to guide a mariner's compass, while others utilized the rigid grids of latitude and longitude. To bring them together onto a single skin of gazelle hide, Piri Reis had to adjust their scales and shift their orientations, a process of mathematical translation that seems almost too sophisticated for the tools of his time. Yet it is the 19th map he mentions that truly stirs the imagination and haunts the periphery of our understanding. He speaks of a map belonging to Christopher Columbus, a lost map of the New World that has never been found by modern historians. According to the admiral's notes, he obtained this precious document through a Spanish prisoner who had sailed with Columbus on 3 of his voyages to the Caribbean. This prisoner, captured during a naval engagement, allegedly possessed a chart that Columbus himself had used to navigate the unknown reaches of the Western Ocean. We are left to wonder, what did Columbus see on that map before he ever left the shores of Spain? Was he too following the outlines of a much older world, guided by a draftsmanship that had survived the collapse of empires? The synthesis of these disparate projections onto a single piece of leather required a level of precision that borders on the miraculous. Imagine the difficulty of taking a map drawn on a flat plane and another drawn to account for the curvature of the Earth, and then stitching them together without losing the true shape of the continents. Piri Reis was essentially trying to solve a spherical puzzle on a 2-dimensional surface, centuries before the development of modern cartographic software, and so, as he worked, he was not just drawing land, he was layering time itself. The northern sections of the map reflect the most current discoveries of the Spanish and Portuguese, vibrant and relatively accurate for the period. But as the eye travels further south, past the equator and down toward the mysterious Terra Australis, the sources seem to shift. The ink begins to trace a coastline that defies the logic of the 16th century, a landmass that appears to be Antarctica, yet stripped of its white shroud of ice. This is the central mystery that lingers in the quiet spaces between the lines. If Piri Reis used ancient source maps, as he claimed, who were the original surveyors? To map the subglacial topography of a continent buried under miles of frozen water requires more than just a sturdy ship and a compass. It requires a knowledge of the land as it existed thousands of years ago, before the great ice sheets reclaimed the southern reaches of the globe. We find ourselves looking into the deep time of the Younger Dryas, a period roughly 12,000 years ago, when the Earth's climate underwent a sudden and violent shift. It was a time of rising seas and vanishing landscapes, a threshold between the world of the Ice Age and the world we know today. Could it be that some of the 20 maps on the Admiral's desk were survivors of that distant epoch? Perhaps they were copies of copies, preserved in the great libraries of antiquity, passed from hand to hand through the rise and fall of the Phoenicians, the Egyptians and the Greeks, until they finally reached the hands of an Ottoman sailor. The technical process of the map's construction suggests that Piri Reis was looking at data that had been gathered with a level of accuracy we usually associate with the modern era. The longitudinal distances between the coasts of Africa and South America are remarkably precise, a feat that should have been impossible before the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. As we contemplate the skin of the gazelle, we are forced to confront the limits of our own historical narrative. We like to think of progress as a straight line, a steady climb from the darkness of ignorance into the light of discovery, but the Piri Reis map suggests a different story, a story of cycles, of lost peaks of knowledge that were reached and then forgotten, buried under the silt of time and the weight of falling snow. The admiral was a bridge builder, connecting the fragmented memories of a drowned world to the burgeoning curiosity of the Renaissance. He was working with the remnants of a lost stratigraphy, a layering of human effort that spans the millennia. And so, the map remains a silent witness to a conversation that took place 500 years ago between a man and his ghosts. Each line he drew was a choice, a decision to trust the testimony of an ancient chart over the empty spaces of the unknown. He did not see the ice that we see today. He saw a world that was green, or perhaps a world that was just beginning to freeze, captured by an unknown hand at the very edge of a human memory. As we move deeper into the map's construction, we begin to realize that the mystery isn't just about what is drawn on the parchment, but about the vast, silent stretches of time that the map manages to bridge. It is a document that refuses to stay in its century, reaching backward into the deep past and forward into our own questions about who we are and where we have been. The ink is dry, but the map is still breathing, whispering of a time when the stars were different and the southern horizon held a secret that we are only just beginning to remember. If you trace the ink with your eyes, following the jagged edge of the South American coastline as it descends into the cold, grey waters of the Atlantic, you find yourself arriving at a place where geography begins to defy logic. In our modern understanding of the world, the tip of South America terminates at Cape Horn, separated from the frozen reaches of the south by the turbulent, storm-tossed waters of the Drake Passage. A stretch of ocean nearly 500 miles wide, but on the Piri Reis map, the parchment tells a different story. The coastline does not end. Instead, it curves sharply to the east, forming a continuous land bridge that stretches across the bottom of the world, binding the continents together in a seamless embrace of earth and stone. As we look closer at this southern extension, the measured hand of the cartographer reveals a coastline of startling complexity. There are bays, inlets, and mountain ranges depicted with a confidence that suggests a first-hand account, yet this is a region that should, by all accounts of the 16th century, have been hidden beneath miles of impenetrable ice. The map shows a land that is alive, a land of open harbours and rugged peninsulas that seem to breathe under a sun that hasn't touched them in millennia. It is here that the anomaly shifts from a mere curiosity into something far more profound, a mystery that seems to reach back into the deep, dark well of human history. In the middle of the 20th century, when the world was beginning to look at its own past through the lens of modern science, this specific portion of the map fell under the scrutiny of Captain Arlington Mallory, a researcher who specialized in ancient maps. He noticed something that should not have been possible. When he compared the contours of the Piri Reis coastline to the most recent seismic surveys of the Antarctic continent, the outlines matched with a precision that was unsettling. Specifically, the map seemed to mirror the subglacial topography of Queen Maud Land, the actual shape of the landmass as it exists beneath the ice. To understand the weight of this, one must consider the nature of the ice itself. The Antarctic ice sheet is not a thin veil. In many places, it is over a mile thick, a heavy white shroud that has flattened the world beneath it for millions of years. To see the true shape of the coast, modern scientists must use sophisticated sonar and seismic sounding, pulses of energy that penetrate the frozen crust to bounce off the bedrock below, and yet, here on a fragment of gazelle skin from 1513, the profile of the hidden land is laid bare, as if someone had walked those shores when the air was warm and the waves lapped against a rocky beach instead of a wall of blue ice. The initial scientific shock that rippled through the academic community in the 1950s was palpable. It was a moment of profound cognitive dissonance, a collision between what we thought we knew about the timeline of human civilization and what the physical evidence was whispering from the page. If the map is accurate, it implies that the source maps Piri Reis used were drawn at a time when the Antarctic coast was free of ice. This leads us into the realm of chronostratigraphy, the study of the ages of rock and ice layers. Mainstream science generally suggests that the Antarctic ice sheet has been in place for at least 15 million years, but some geological evidence suggests that certain coastal areas may have remained ice-free much later, perhaps as recently as 6,000 or even 10,000 years ago. Even so, the timeline remains a haunting puzzle. 10,000 years ago, during the transition out of the last great ice age, humanity was supposed to be in its infancy, a collection of hunter-gatherers just beginning to experiment with the first seeds of agriculture. The idea of a civilization capable of high seas navigation, sophisticated surveying, and the complex mathematics required for spherical trigonometry, the science of mapping a round Earth onto a flat surface, simply does not fit into the established narrative. It is a ghost in the machine of history. As the years passed, the analysis of the map moved from the hands of cartographers into the offices of the United States Air Force Reconnaissance Technical Squadron. In 1960, a letter was sent from the commander of that unit to Professor Charles Hapgood, stating that the geographical details shown in the lower part of the map agreed remarkably well with the results of the seismic profile made across the top of the ice cap by the Swedish-British Antarctic expedition of 1949. The letter confirmed that the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap, and that the ice in this region is now about a mile thick. The silence that follows such a revelation is heavy with the weight of forgotten ages. We are forced to ask how such knowledge could have survived the rise and fall of countless empires. Perhaps it was passed down through a chain of mariners whose names have been erased by time, a lineage of explorers who saw the world when it looked very different than it does today. They would have seen the great southern landmass as a place of possibility, a frontier of green and grey rather than a wasteland of white. They would have navigated by stars that have since shifted their positions in the sky, guided by a celestial clock that ticks in cycles of tens of thousands of years. The absence of the Drake Passage on the map is perhaps the most evocative detail of all. It suggests a world where the oceans were lower, or perhaps a world where the very crust of the earth had not yet settled into its current configuration. It speaks of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt and cataclysmic climate change roughly 12,800 years ago, when the world was plunged back into a sudden, deep freeze after a brief period of warming. It was a time of fire and flood, of rising seas and vanishing lands. Is it possible that the Piri Reis map is a lingering echo from the other side of that catastrophe? There is a certain comfort in the mystery, a gentle reminder that for all our satellites and sensors, we are still just scratching at the surface of a very old and very deep story. The map is a bridge, not just between South America and Antarctica, but between our modern certainty and a past that is far more complex than we dare to imagine. It invites us to sit in the quiet spaces of history, to listen to the rustle of the parchment and the phantom sound of waves hitting a shore that has been buried for 10,000 years. As we linger on these details, the mind begins to wander through the corridors of deep time. We imagine the ancient cartographer, hunched over a desk in a city that may no longer exist, carefully copying lines from a map that was already ancient in his own day. He works by the flickering light of an oil lamp, unaware that his efforts will one day challenge the foundations of 20th century science. He is simply a keeper of records, a weaver of threads, ensuring that the shape of the world is not forgotten, even as the ice begins to crawl across the southern horizon. The contours of Queen Maud Land, the bays of the Princess Martha Coast, they are all there, rendered in a faded ink that seems to shimmer with the ghosts of a lost world. We are left with the realization that our maps are only as good as our memories, and that the earth itself is a great, revolving archive, a sphere of stone and ice that hides its secrets well. The Piri Reis map is a key, but it is a key to a door we are not yet entirely sure we are ready to open, a door that leads back into a time when the map of the world was still being written by a civilization we are only just beginning to remember. In the quiet halls of Keene State College during the early 1960s, a history professor named Charles Hapgood began to pull at a loose thread in the tapestry of our past, one that threatened to unravel the entire fabric of established geology. He was a man who lived in the quiet company of old books and faded parchment, yet his mind was tethered to a vision of the earth that was anything but static. In 1966, he would release a work that would become a cornerstone for those who look at the horizon and see the shadows of something forgotten. He titled it Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, a name that evokes the salt spray of unknown oceans and the creaking of timber in winds that died thousands of years ago. Hapgood's premise was as simple as it was radical. He looked at the Piri Reis map and others like it, and he did not see the clumsy errors of 16th century sailors. Instead, he saw a precision that should not have existed. He saw the contours of a world that had been surveyed with a mathematical grace far beyond the reach of the Renaissance. But more startling than the accuracy of the coastlines was the climate they suggested. As he pored over the jagged edges of the Antarctic coast depicted on the map, he realized he was looking at a landmass that was not yet entombed in its white shroud. He was looking at a world where the ice had not yet claimed the southern tip of the globe. To explain how such a thing could be possible, Hapgood turned away from the slow, grinding pace of traditional geology and toward a theory he called crustal displacement. Imagine, if you will, the earth as a giant orange. The meat of the fruit is the mantle, solid and heavy, while the peel is the thin crust upon which we build our cities and sail our ships. Hapgood proposed that this outer skin was not permanently fixed to the core. He suggested that, under certain stresses, perhaps the massive, uneven weight of growing polar ice caps, the entire crust could slide, shifting like a loose garment over the body of the earth. In this sudden, catastrophic movement, lands that were once temperate would be thrust into the freezing dark of the poles, while frozen wastes would slide toward the warmth of the equator. In this vision of deep time, Antarctica did not always sit at the bottom of the world. It was once a place of flowing rivers and green valleys, a land that could support life and, perhaps, the inquisitive minds of a seafaring people. Hapgood argued that this shift happened recently, at least in the grand, sweeping scale of the Earth's life. He suggested that the crust had slipped as recently as 12,000 years ago, during the end of the last great ice age, a period known as the Pleistocene. It was a time of wandering mammoths and rising seas, a time when the world was reshaping itself in a violent, shivering transition. Hapgood knew that such a bold claim required more than just the intuition of a historian. He sought the cold, hard validation of science. In 1960, he reached out to the United States Air Force, specifically the 8th Reconnaissance Technical Squadron at Westover Air Force Base. He presented them with the Piri Reis map and a specific haunting question: did the map truly show the subglacial topography of Antarctica? Could it be that this map, drawn in 1513, showed the mountains and valleys of the Queen Maud Land coast as they exist beneath the ice today? The response he received was enough to send a chill through the spine of the academic world. The commander of the squadron, Lieutenant Colonel Harold Ohlmeyer, wrote back to confirm that the geographical details in the lower part of the map agreed remarkably well with the results of the seismic profile made by the Swedish-British Antarctic expedition of 1949. The Air Force concluded that the coastline had been mapped before it was covered by the ice cap. And then came the most unsettling detail of all. The ice cap in that region is now about a mile thick. This revelation hangs in the air like a heavy mist. If the map is accurate, it means the original surveys must have been conducted at a time when the coast of Antarctica was free of ice. According to the mainstream understanding of stratigraphy, the study of rock layers and their ages, the Antarctic ice sheet has been in place for millions of years. But Hapgood's evidence, bolstered by the Air Force's assessment, suggested a different timeline altogether. It suggested that the ice might be a much younger tenant of the southern continent. He leaned on the work of researchers who had studied core samples from the bottom of the Ross Sea. These samples contained fine-grained sediments, the kind of silt that is carried into the ocean by flowing rivers. Using ionium dating, a method of measuring the decay of radioactive elements in the soil, scientists found that these sediments had been deposited as recently as 6,000 years ago. For a brief moment in the long memory of the Earth, the rivers of Antarctica were flowing. The sun was warming the soil, and the ice had retreated. As the years passed, Hapgood's theory gained an unlikely and prestigious supporter, Albert Einstein. The two men corresponded, and Einstein found the idea of crustal displacement to be of great significance. He wrote the foreword to one of Hapgood's books, noting that in a polar region there is a continual deposition of ice which is not symmetrically distributed about the pole. The Earth's rotation acts on these unsymmetrically deposited masses, creating a centrifugal momentum that is transmitted to the rigid crust. Einstein agreed that if this weight became great enough, the crust would eventually give way, sliding like a tectonic plate on a journey toward a new equilibrium. This shift would be a global apocalypse. As the crust moved, the oceans would wash over the continents in massive surges. The atmosphere would be whipped into storms of unimaginable fury. And for any civilization living during such a time, the world would literally seem to be turning upside down. The stars would shift their positions in the sky, and the very ground beneath their feet would migrate thousands of miles. If a great maritime culture existed before this shift, their maps would become the only surviving records of a geography that no longer existed. We must wonder then about the people who stood on those ice-free shores 6,000 years ago. If the Piri Reis map is a copy of a copy, descending from a time when the Queen moored land was a green coast, who were the original cartographers? They would have needed a sophisticated understanding of spherical trigonometry to project the curved surface of the Earth onto a flat map with such precision. They would have needed instruments to measure longitude, a feat that modern history tells us was not possible until the 18th century. We are faced with a choice between two mysteries. Either the Piri Reis map is a series of incredible coincidences, a collection of lucky guesses that happen to align with the hidden mountains beneath a mile of ice, or it is a message from a deep, forgotten past. It is a signpost pointing toward a lost epoch of human history, a time when the world was mapped by a civilization that understood the movements of the stars and the shape of the earth, long before the first pyramids were raised in the sands of Egypt. Hapgood's work invites us to look at the globe not as a fixed and finished thing, but as a restless, breathing entity. It reminds us that our knowledge of the past is built on the fragments that survive the fire and the flood. As we drift further into the story of the map, we begin to see that the ice of Antarctica is more than just frozen water. It is a great white veil draped over the ruins of a world we are only just beginning to imagine. A world that was once vibrant, once mapped, and once known by those who sailed the ancient seas under a different sky. Consider for a moment the sheer weight of a single degree of longitude. To the modern mind, it is a mere coordinate on a screen, a digital ghost that guides us with invisible precision. But to the ancients, it was the ultimate riddle of the horizon. Measuring latitude is a gift from the stars, a simple calculation of the sun's height or the tilt of the North Star. But longitude requires the mastery of time itself. It demands a clock that does not falter on a pitching deck, and a mathematical language capable of translating the curve of a sphere onto the flat surface of a skin or a page. This is the language of spherical trigonometry, a complex discipline that mainstream history tells us was not fully realized until the 18th century. Yet, as we trace the delicate coastlines on the Piri Reis map, we find ourselves staring at a ghost in the machine. The precision is there, whispered in the placement of islands and the sweep of continental shelves, suggesting that someone, long before the rise of the pharaohs, had already solved the riddle of the turning earth. This realization leads us away from the familiar paths of history and into the quiet, echoing halls of a forgotten era. It suggests the existence of what some researchers call a mother culture, a sophisticated global civilization that flourished in the deep shadows of the late Pleistocene. This was not a world of primitive hunter-gatherers huddled in caves, but perhaps a maritime empire that viewed the oceans not as barriers, but as highways. While the conventional timeline of human progress depicts a slow, agonizing climb from stone tools to bronze swords, the map hints at a sudden, brilliant peak that occurred before the great ice began to melt. We are looking at the possibility of a lost maritime tradition that possessed a level of technological grace we are only just beginning to comprehend. A culture that understood the dimensions of the globe, while the rest of humanity was still learning to till the earth. Imagine these ancient sea kings standing upon the wooden decks of vessels that have long since rotted into the silt of the ocean floor. They would have watched the same constellations we see today, though shifted slightly by the slow wobble of the Earth's axis. To them, the world was whole, mapped and interconnected. They did not see the Atlantic or the Southern Ocean as terrifying voids, but as charted territories. They possessed the tools to calculate their position with a mathematical elegance that seems impossible for their time. This is not to say they had computers or satellites, but rather a profound, lost science of observation and calculation, a way of seeing the world that was perhaps more attuned to the rhythms of the planet than our own noisy, industrial age. As the centuries drifted into millennia, the memory of this civilization began to fade, leaving behind only these strange, impossible fragments, maps of maps, copied and recopied by later cultures who no longer understood the source of the data they were preserving. Who were these people who mapped the world before the rise of Sumer or Egypt? When we look at the stratigraphy of our past, that is, the layers of soil and debris that tell the story of time, we find a curious gap. We see the sudden emergence of high civilization in Mesopotamia and the Nile Valley, appearing almost out of nowhere with fully formed writing systems, complex laws, and monumental architecture. It is as if they inherited a legacy, rather than inventing one from scratch. Perhaps the Piri Reis map is a lingering echo of that inheritance. It speaks of a time when the Antarctic was not a frozen wasteland, but a destination. If a culture was capable of mapping the subglacial topography of a continent, they must have possessed a global reach, a network of trade and exploration that spanned from the verdant coasts of the Americas to the then temperate reaches of the far south. The philosophical implications of such a discovery are as vast as the oceans themselves. It forces us to confront the fragility of our own achievements and the cyclical nature of human knowledge. We like to believe in a linear progression of history, a steady march toward greater enlightenment. But the map suggests that we are a species with amnesia. It tells us that great heights can be reached and then utterly forgotten, buried beneath the rising tides or the encroaching ice of a changing climate. We are walking among the ruins of a world we forgot we ever built. In this view of history, the Dark Ages are not just a period of European history, but a recurring theme in the human story, intervals of forgetting that separate the great flourishes of global civilization. As we ponder these ancient navigators, we must consider the environment they inhabited during the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt and cataclysmic climate change that occurred roughly 12,800 years ago. This was a time of fire and flood, when the great ice sheets of the north collapsed, sending pulses of meltwater into the oceans and causing sea levels to rise hundreds of feet. In such a world, any coastal civilization, the kind that would produce master cartographers and sea kings, would have been the first to vanish. Their ports, their libraries, and their very history would have been swallowed by the sea, leaving only the high-altitude survivors to start the story of humanity over again. The maps they left behind were the only things that didn't sink. Fragile relics passed from hand to hand, from the survivors of the flood to the kings of the ancient world, eventually finding their way into the hands of a Turkish admiral in the year 1513. This mother culture remains a ghost, a presence felt in the uncanny accuracy of old charts but never quite captured by the archaeologist's spade. They exist in the anomalous data, the things that shouldn't be there but are. The mathematical precision required for the Piri Reis map suggests a level of astronomical knowledge that rivals that of the Renaissance. It requires an understanding of the Earth's circumference and the ability to use a grid system of latitude and longitude that was supposedly not perfected until the invention of the marine chronometer. And yet, there it is, the ghost of a world that knew its own shape long before we thought it possible. We are left to wonder if our ancestors were not the children we imagine them to be, but rather the weary survivors of a much older and more sophisticated era. As the night deepens and the mind wanders through these forgotten corridors of time, the map becomes more than just an artifact. It becomes a mirror. It reflects a version of ourselves that we have lost, a version that was more connected to the stars and the sea, and perhaps more aware of the precariousness of life on a changing planet. We see in those faded lines the shadows of ships that sailed under a different sky, guided by a science that has since been labelled as myth or legend. But the map is not a myth. It is a physical object, a piece of gazelle skin that survived the fires of history to tell us that we do not know nearly as much as we think we do. The ice of Antarctica remains silent, a 2-mile thick tombstone for whatever lies beneath. But the maps suggest that the tomb was once a cradle. They suggest that the sea kings of the ancient world looked upon those shores and saw forests instead of glaciers and mountains instead of ice caps. They saw a world that was vibrant and accessible. As we drift toward sleep, we might imagine those ancient explorers, their hands tracing the same coastlines we now study with satellites. They were the first to know the true face of the earth, and though their names have been erased by the winds of time, their work remains, a silent, mathematical testimony to a lost age of wonder that existed long before the first stone was laid at Giza. The story of the map is the story of our own forgotten potential, a reminder that beneath the ice and the dust of millennia, the truth of our past is waiting to be rediscovered. To understand how a map from the 1600s could depict a landmass that shouldn't have been discovered for another 3 centuries, we must first descend into the quiet, dust-filled libraries of the ancient mind. Long before the first wooden hull breached the icy waters of the Antarctic Circle, there existed a ghost in the collective imagination of the West, a phantom continent known as Terra Australis Incognita, or the unknown southern land. This was not merely a sailor's yarn, or a legend whispered in taverns, but a rigorous philosophical necessity that haunted the maps of the Greeks and the scholars of the Renaissance alike. They looked at the world not just through the lens of what they could see, but through a deep, intuitive sense of balance and symmetry. The great thinkers of antiquity, such as Aristotle and Ptolemy, looked at the sprawling land masses of the northern hemisphere, the vast reaches of Eurasia and northern Africa, and felt a profound sense of cosmic unease. To their eyes, the earth was a divine instrument, and an instrument must be balanced. They reasoned that if there was such a tremendous weight of earth in the north, there must be a corresponding weight in the south to prevent the world from simply toppling over into the void of space. This concept of the antipodes was a mathematical requirement for a stable planet. It was a beautiful, if unproven, symmetry, a belief that the unseen parts of our world were a mirror image of the known. And so, for nearly 2,000 years, cartographers drew a massive sprawling continent at the bottom of their charts, often stretching it from the tip of South America all the way to the islands of the East Indies. As we move into the era of the Renaissance, this philosophical ghost began to take on a more solid, yet no less mysterious, form. The mapmakers of the 15 and 1600s were caught in a strange transition between the age of faith and the age of empirical survey. They were artists as much as they were scientists, and the blank spaces of a map were considered a failure of the imagination, a vacuum that nature and the inkpot abhorred. When a navigator returned with news of a new coastline, the cartographer would weave that small thread of data into a grand tapestry of speculation. They would fill the vast, empty oceans with sea monsters, wind gods, and the jagged, theoretical shores of the great southern continent. It was a practice of artistic license, where the beauty of the composition often held as much weight as the accuracy of the coordinates. But here, the mystery deepens and begins to pull at the fabric of our conventional history. We must ask ourselves where the imagination ends and where a forgotten record begins. It is one thing to draw a decorative landmass to balance a globe. It is quite another to trace the specific inlets, mountain ranges, and river valleys of a continent that is supposedly buried under 2 miles of ancient ice. In the quiet study of a 16th century monk or a royal geographer, the quill moves across the vellum with a strange, haunting precision. They were not just drawing a blob of ink to fill a void. In certain rare instances, they were recording details that seemed to defy the limits of their era. In the world of archaeology, we often speak of stratigraphy, the way that time lays down layers of earth, one on top of the other, like the pages of a very old book. Usually we find the simplest tools at the bottom and the most complex at the top, but the cartographic tradition of the unknown south suggests a different kind of layering, a horizontal stratigraphy where ancient, accurate knowledge is buried beneath centuries of medieval guesswork and Renaissance flourish. It is as if these mapmakers were working from fragments of an older, much more sophisticated library, a collection of charts that survived the fires of antiquity and the slow decay of the Dark Ages. They were copying from copies of copies, and in that process, the original empirical data, the hard, surveyed facts of a lost civilization, became blurred and blended with the myths of the day. We are left to wonder about the source of this silent testimony. If the Greeks believed in a southern landmass because of philosophy, and the Renaissance artists drew it because of aesthetics, why do some of these maps align so closely with the sub-glacial topography of Antarctica? This is the land beneath the ice, the world as it appeared before the Great Freeze. To map such a place requires more than a sense of balance. It requires a physical presence, a ship on the water, and a navigator with a chronometer and a compass. It requires the kind of systematic survey that we associate with the modern world, yet the dates on the parchment tell a different story. They speak of a time when the world was younger and perhaps more connected than we dare to imagine. The tragedy of the cartographic tradition is that as we move toward more scientific mapping in the 18th and 19th centuries, these speculative southern lands began to disappear. As explorers like Captain Cook sailed further south and found only ice and empty sea, the grand continent of Terra Australis was erased from the maps, replaced by the honest, cold emptiness of the Southern Ocean. The mystery was seemingly solved, the ghost was exorcised, and yet the Piri Reis map and its contemporaries remain, like echoes in a canyon that refuse to fade away. They suggest that the speculation of the ancients wasn't speculation at all, but a fading memory of a time when the South was not a frozen wasteland, but a green and navigable frontier. As the years passed, the distinction between artistic license and empirical data became the great dividing line in our understanding of the past. Modern science demands a paper trail, a record of the voyage, the name of the captain, and the logs of the journey. Because these records are missing, we are told that the maps must be a coincidence, a lucky guess born of a desire for symmetry. But as we look closer at the winding rivers and the placement of the mountain chains on these ancient charts, the coincidence begins to feel heavy, like a weight that the scales of history can no longer support. We are looking at a world that existed before the ice, a world that was mapped by hands we do not recognize, using techniques we thought were invented only yesterday. Meanwhile, the ice of Antarctica continues its slow, grinding crawl toward the sea, hiding the secrets of the continent's true shape. It is a silent guardian of a history that doesn't fit into our neat timelines, but the maps remain, fragile, yellowed sheets of parchment that whisper of a lost age of wonder. They remind us that our ancestors may have known the earth more intimately than we give them credit for, and that the unknown was once a place of vibrant life and charted shores. The story of the map is not just a story of ink and paper. It is a reflection of our own forgotten potential, a reminder that beneath the layers of time and the dust of millennia, the truth of our past is waiting, patient and cold, for the moment it can finally be told. Consider the sensation of a cold wind blowing across a laboratory, carrying with it the invisible weight of millions of years of accumulated snow, while the imagination wanders through the lush green valleys of a prehistoric South Pole. The steady hand of modern science reaches down through the frozen layers to touch a different reality. Geologists, armed with long, hollow drills, have spent decades pulling cores of ice from the heart of the Antarctic continent, reading the history of our planet like the rings of an ancient petrified tree. These cylinders of frozen time tell a story that stretches back far beyond the dawn of human writing. The evidence gathered from these deep-seated layers suggests that the great ice sheet has been a permanent fixture of the southern world for at least 15 million years. This process of stratigraphy, the study of rock and ice layers, reveals a slow, rhythmic pulse of glaciation that does not easily allow for a sudden, ice-free continent within the span of human memory. And so, we find ourselves standing at a crossroads between the poetic maps of the past and the rigid data of the present. As we look closer at the Piri Reis map, a different possibility begins to emerge from the ink, one that is perhaps less mystical but no less fascinating. Some researchers suggest that the mysterious landmass we interpret as Antarctica is not a separate continent at all, but rather a clever, if somewhat distorted, continuation of the South American coastline. In the 16th century, mapmakers often found themselves running out of space on their precious parchment. To accommodate the vast distances of the New World, they would sometimes bend the coastline to fit the dimensions of the page, curving the shores of what we now call Brazil and Argentina toward the east. This distortion, born of necessity and limited perspective, may have inadvertently created the illusion of a northern Antarctic shore where none existed. When we examine the tiny, meticulous handwriting scattered across the map, the mystery deepens further. These toponyms, the names given to places by their discoverers, carry the distinct flavour of the 16th century Portuguese maritime tradition. We find references to the River of Canaries and the Cape of San Roque, names that align perfectly with the voyages of explorers like Amerigo Vespucci. These sailors were pushing further south than any Europeans had ever dared, tracing the endless beaches of South America under a sun that grew weaker with every passing league. It is possible that the map is a composite of these very real journeys, stitched together by Piri Reis from fragments of charts that were already becoming the foundational documents of the modern world. The ice-free mountains and rivers may simply be the familiar landmarks of the southern Atlantic, transposed by a cartographer who was trying to make sense of a world that was expanding faster than the human mind could follow. As the years passed, the human tendency to see what we desire to see became a powerful force in the interpretation of these ancient artifacts. This is the subtle work of cognitive bias, a mental shortcut, where our brains seek out patterns that confirm our existing beliefs or hopes. When we look at a smudge of ink on a 500-year-old map and see the Queen Maudland coast, are we seeing the truth of the past, or are we projecting our own longing for a lost golden age? We want to believe in a world where the maps are perfect and the history is hidden, because it makes the universe feel more intentional, more layered with meaning. The mind is a master of filling in the blanks, of turning a curved line into a mountain range and a blank space into a forgotten empire. Meanwhile, the technical reality of the map's creation invites us to consider the limits of what was truly known. During the 16th century, the concept of longitude was still a frustrating puzzle that would not be fully solved for another 200 years. Navigators could determine their latitude by the stars, but their east to west position was often a matter of educated guesswork and dead reckoning. This inherent uncertainty led to maps that were beautiful but mathematically fluid, where islands could drift across the ocean and continents could stretch or shrink depending on the sailor's account. When we apply modern cartographic standards to a map drawn in 1513, we are essentially trying to read a dream with a ruler. The precision we think we see might be a ghost of our own modern making, a coincidence of shape that aligns with our satellite imagery only by the grace of chance. Yet even with these scientific rebuttals, a sense of unease remains. If the map is merely a distorted South America, why does the transition between the continents feel so deliberate? Why do some of the geographical features seem to mirror the subglacial topography, the shape of the land beneath the ice that was only mapped in the 20th century using seismic sounding? This is the process of bouncing sound waves off the bedrock to see what lies beneath the frozen crust, a technology that would have been indistinguishable from magic to a 16th century admiral. The debate between the cold, hard facts of geology and the suggestive lines of the map creates a tension that is never quite resolved. It leaves us in a state of quiet contemplation, wondering if there are still ways of knowing that have been lost to us, buried under the weight of standardized education and the rigid structures of modern thought. As we dwell on these possibilities, we must also consider the role of the Younger Dryas, a period of abrupt climate change that occurred roughly 12,800 years ago. While mainstream science places the freezing of Antarctica millions of years in the past, some fringe theories suggest that a cataclysmic shift during this era could have altered the world's coastlines in ways we are only beginning to understand. If a civilization existed before this great cooling, their maps might have survived in fragments, copied and recopied by later cultures who no longer understood the original context. It is a haunting thought, that we might be looking at the echoes of a world that perished in fire and ice, a world whose only surviving testament is a single sheet of gazelle skin kept in a Turkish palace. The maps of the past are not just tools for navigation, they are mirrors of the human soul and its relationship with the unknown. They represent the boundary between the light of discovery and the darkness of the unexplored. Whether the Piri Reis map shows a prehistoric Antarctica or a beautifully rendered mistake, it serves as a reminder of the fragility of our knowledge. Our understanding of the earth is a thin veneer, a fragile layer of certainty resting atop a vast and deep history that remains largely silent. We move through our lives on a planet that has seen empires rise and fall, continents drift, and oceans boil and freeze, yet we often forget how little of that story we actually possess. In the quiet of the modern laboratory, the ice cores sit in their chilled racks, silent witnesses to the passage of eons. They do not care for the debates of men or the ink of cartographers. They simply exist, holding the atmosphere of 1,000,000 years ago in tiny, trapped bubbles of air. And yet the map remains on its pedestal, challenging us to look again, to question the boundaries of the possible, and to remember that the earth still holds secrets that no drill can reach and no satellite can see. It is in this space between the proven and the felt that the true history of our world resides, a history that is as vast as the Southern Ocean and as enduring as the ice itself. The smell of old vellum is a scent like no other, a faint, sweet musk of dried animal skin, dust, and the ghosts of ink that have survived half a millennium of humidity and sunlight. It is the scent of a library that refuses to stay silent, even when the books are closed and the scholars have gone home for the evening. As we move away from the singular mystery of the Piri Reis map, we find that the Turkish admiral was not a lone voice crying out from the 16th century. If his map were the only one to show these impossible coastlines, we might dismiss it as a beautiful, accidental hallucination of the pen. But as we leaf through the heavy, crackling pages of the Renaissance, we find that the ghost of a southern continent haunts the work of many others, appearing and disappearing like a phantom ship in the fog of history. In the year 1531, a French mathematician and cartographer named Oronce Finé published a world map that presents a challenge so profound it seems to vibrate against the very foundations of modern geology. Finé was a man of the High Renaissance, a refined intellectual who served as the chair of mathematics at the Collège Royal. He was not a man given to flights of fancy or the invention of fairy tales. Yet his cordiform, or heart-shaped map, depicts a massive landmass at the bottom of the world, a continent he calls Terra Australis. What makes Finé's work so unsettling is not just the presence of this land, but the intimate, textured detail of its features. Unlike the vague, rounded blobs one might expect from a cartographer guessing at a distant shore, Finé's map shows mountain ranges that seem to follow the actual topographical spine of Antarctica. He depicts coastal inlets and deep estuaries that correspond with uncanny precision to the subglacial valleys we have only recently mapped using ice-penetrating radar. Most hauntingly of all, he shows the mouths of rivers where today there are only massive, slow-moving glaciers, rivers that would have required a temperate climate to flow. To look at the Oronce Finé map is to see a world that has been forgotten for thousands of years. It suggests a time when the Ross Sea was not a shelf of ice hundreds of feet thick, but an open waterway where a ship might find safe harbour. It speaks of a period in deep time when the great white desert was perhaps a green expanse of fern and forest. Geologists tell us that the last time these areas were free of ice was long before the rise of any known civilization, and yet here is the ink on the page, drawn with the steady hand of a mathematician who claimed to be working from ancient authoritative sources. As the years passed, and the great age of exploration continued to unfold, these anomalies did not fade away. They multiplied. In 1559, nearly 30 years after Finé, a Turkish cartographer named Hadji Ahmed produced a remarkable woodblock wall map of the world. Ahmed's map is famous among historians for its unusual shape and its incredible detail, but for those who look for the fingerprints of a lost age, one specific feature stands out above all others. Between the far eastern edge of Siberia and the western reaches of Alaska, where the cold grey waters of the Bering Strait now churn, Hadji Ahmed drew a solid bridge of land. He depicted a world where a traveller could walk from Asia to the Americas without ever wetting their feet. This is the region known to science as Beringia, a land bridge that hasn't existed in its entirety since the end of the last ice age, roughly 10 to 12,000 years ago. In the mid-16th century, no European or Ottoman explorer had yet reached the Bering Strait. The official discovery of this passage would not happen for nearly 200 years, and yet Ahmed's map shows a geographical reality that belongs to the Pleistocene, a time of mammoths and melting glaciers, a time when the sea levels were hundreds of feet lower than they are today. How did a mapmaker in the 16th century know the shape of a drowned world? How did he know that the continents were once joined by a neck of earth that had long since been swallowed by the rising tide of the Holocene? The presence of these details across different maps, created by different men in different countries, suggests a pattern that is difficult to ignore. It is as if we are looking at the scattered pieces of a much older puzzle. These cartographers often wrote in their margins that they were not the original authors of the geography they depicted. They spoke of ancient charts, of venerable sources, and of maps salvaged from libraries that had burned to the ground centuries before they were born. Meanwhile, we must consider the possibility that there once existed a shared, now lost source library in the Mediterranean, a central repository of knowledge that acted as a bridge between the high civilizations of antiquity and the awakening world of the Renaissance. We might imagine a collection of scrolls and animal skin maps, perhaps housed in the great library of Alexandria, or passed down through the secretive guilds of Byzantine sea captains. These documents would have contained the accumulated wisdom of a seafaring people whose name has been erased from the historical record, a people who sailed the world when the ice was retreating and the coastlines looked very different than they do today. This theory of a lost source helps to explain why so many Renaissance maps share the same strange accuracies and the same curious errors. It is as if Finé, Ahmed, and Piri Reis were all looking at the same faded photograph and trying to trace its lines with their own modern pens. They were interpreting a legacy they didn't fully understand, copying the work of masters who had seen the world in a state of flux, a world of shifting ice and emerging islands. In the quiet of a study, under the soft glow of a candle, these map-makers were engaging in a form of silent time travel. They were reaching back through the layers of stratigraphy, that geological record of time written in the earth's soil, to a period known as the Younger Dryas. This was a time of chaotic climate shifts, a 1,000-year cold snap that gripped the planet just as the last ice age was ending. It was a time of great floods and sudden freezes, a time when the map of the world was being rewritten by nature itself. The maps of the 16th century seem to capture the echoes of this era. They show us a version of our planet that exists just beyond the reach of our written history, a world where the Antarctic mountains were visible to the naked eye and the path to the new world was a walk across a grassy plain. We are left to wonder about the hands that first drew those lines. Were they the hands of a civilization that perished in the rising waters? Were they survivors of a global catastrophe who sought to preserve the shape of their home before the waves claimed it forever? As we contemplate these questions, the measured pace of the clock seems to slow. The boundaries between the past and the present begin to blur, much like the ink on an old chart. We realize that our understanding of deep time, the vast multi-million-year history of our planet, is often limited by our own short memories. We tend to think of the Earth as a static thing, but these maps remind us that the world is a breathing, changing entity. The ice comes and the ice goes. The mountains rise and the seas swallow the plains. The maps of Oronce, Finé and Hadji Ahmed are more than just historical curiosities. They are windows into a forgotten reality, invitations to consider that the story of humanity might be much older and much more complex than we have been led to believe. They suggest that before the first pyramids were built, before the first cities of Mesopotamia rose from the sand, there were eyes watching the southern stars and hands mapping the frozen ends of the earth. And so, we sit in the stillness of the present, looking back at these remnants of a lost science. We feel the weight of the ages pressing down on us, the cold breath of the glaciers and the warmth of a sun that once shone on an ice-free Antarctica. The mystery remains unsolved, tucked away in the drawers of archives and the corners of our imagination, a reminder that the most profound truths are often hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to find the key to the map. The creak of seasoned oak against the rhythmic swell of the Atlantic is a sound that has echoed through the centuries, a constant heartbeat for those who dared to venture beyond the sight of land. Imagine, if you will, the deck of a 16th century caravel, its timbers saturated with the brine of 1,000 leagues and the scent of drying hemp and salt-cured meats. To understand the Piri Reis map, we must first inhabit the world of the men who gathered the data it contains, a world where the stars were not distant nuclear furnaces, but fixed lanterns in a divine architecture. In this era of discovery, the navigator was a bridge between the mystical and the mathematical, standing on a tilting deck with instruments that seem primitive to our modern eyes, yet possessed a quiet, elegant precision. The astrolabe, a heavy brass disc etched with the complex geometry of the heavens, was the primary tool for catching the sun or a chosen star. A sailor would hang it from a single finger, letting gravity find the true vertical, while he aligned a pivoting bar with a celestial body to determine his latitude. It was a slow, meditative process, often requiring two men to steady one another against the roll of the sea, a patient dialogue between the swaying ship and the silent, rotating cosmos. Beside it lay the quadrant, a simple wedge of wood or metal with a plumb line that whispered of the ship's position relative to the horizon. These tools allowed the mariner to know how far north or south he had travelled, but they offered no answer to the most haunting question of the deep ocean. How far had he moved toward the setting sun? The problem of longitude remained a ghost in the machine of early navigation, a puzzle that would not be fully solved for another 200 years. Without a marine chronometer, a clock capable of keeping perfect time despite the humidity and the chaotic motion of a ship, the sailors of the 16th century were essentially blind to their east-west progress. They relied on dead reckoning, a term that feels heavy with the weight of its own uncertainty. They would cast a knotted rope into the churning wake to estimate their speed and peer at the colour of the water or the flight of birds to guess their proximity to unseen shores. And yet, the Piri Reis map displays a startlingly accurate longitudinal relationship between the coasts of Africa and South America. We find ourselves wondering how such precision was achieved in an age of guesswork, if perhaps the mapmakers were drawing upon a tradition of measurement that has since been bleached from the historical record. As the damp mist of the morning settles over the rigging, the pilot would consult his portolan charts. These were not the maps we recognize today, filled with the vast interiors of continents. but were instead focused entirely on the fringe where the land meets the sea. They are spider webs of rum lines, straight paths radiating from compass roses that crisscross the parchment like the silk of a master weaver. These lines did not account for the curvature of the earth, yet they guided ships with uncanny reliability from port to port. The portolan was a practical tool, a tactile record of headlands, hidden reefs, and the safe embrace of harbours, often decorated with miniature flags and tiny hand-painted mountains. It was a living document stained by sweat and seawater, passed from hand to hand until its edges frayed into the fabric of history itself. Life aboard these vessels was a sensory immersion in the raw elements. The air was a thick tapestry of wood smoke from the small galley fire, the sharp tang of vinegar used to preserve what little fresh food remained, and the pervasive earthy smell of wet wool. A sailor's world was defined by the tactile, the rough texture of a tarred rope, the freezing spray that numbed the skin during a midnight watch, and the rhythmic thrum of wind vibrating through the masts. There was no silence on the open sea. There was only the chorus of the ship's own groaning joints and the endless, sighing breath of the waves. In the darkness of the hold, illuminated only by the flicker of a horn lantern, the men would sleep in cramped quarters, their dreams filled with the steady tilt and yaw of the world, perhaps unaware that they were traversing waters that may have once been the open highways for a civilization lost to the deep time of the pre-glacial past. The magnetic compass, though revolutionary, was still a source of quiet anxiety for the medieval navigator. They watched as the needle, supposed to point to the true north, would inexplicably drift, a phenomenon we now know as magnetic declination. To a man of the 1500s, this drift felt like a betrayal by nature itself, a subtle shifting of the foundations of reality. They had to learn to compensate for this invisible pull, adjusting their course by instinct and experience. It is here, in the gap between what the instruments showed and what the eyes perceived, that the mystery of the Piri Reis map deepens. To create a map that accounts for the spherical nature of the earth and the correct placement of distant land masses requires more than just a compass and a steady hand. It requires a sophisticated understanding of trigonometry and the very shape of our world. As the years passed and the great age of exploration unfolded, these sailors pushed further into the blue void, driven by a mixture of greed, faith, and an insatiable curiosity. They were the eyes of the old world, peeking through the curtains of the unknown. But as we look at the fine lines and careful annotations of the Piri Reis parchment, we must ask if they were truly the first to see these things. The map suggests a perspective that is almost aerial, a view of the Earth's coastline that seems to predate the rise of the ice sheets that now bury the southern continent. It is as if we are looking at a composite photograph of history, where the 16th century has been layered over an era so distant it has no name. The daily labour of the mariner was a ritual of survival. Every dawn brought the task of checking the bilge, the dark, stagnant water that collected in the bottom of the hull, smelling of rot and ancient depths. Every dusk brought the observation of the stars, those cold, indifferent guides that had watched over the rise and fall of countless empires. There is a profound loneliness in this kind of navigation, a sense of being a small, fragile speck on a vast and uncaring mirror. Yet there is also a connection to the deep past, a realization that the same stars guided the Phoenicians, the Polynesians, and perhaps the architects of the source maps that Piri Reis so carefully consulted. We are left to ponder the limits of what we know about human ingenuity. We often think of progress as a straight line, a steady climb from ignorance to enlightenment, but the evidence suggests something more cyclical, more fragmented. Knowledge is gained, and then it is lost, buried by cataclysm, by the changing of the climate, or simply by the slow erosion of time. The tools of the 16th century, the astrolabe, the quadrant, the portolan, were the pinnacle of their day, but they may also have been the echoes of a much older science, a way of seeing the world that we are only just beginning to rediscover in the quiet corners of our own history. As the ship glides through the water, the wake trailing behind like a fading memory, we feel the presence of those who came before. The map is not just a chart of geography, it is a chart of human persistence, a testament to our desire to map the unmappable and to find our way home through the trackless wastes of the ocean. The mystery of the ice-free Antarctica remains, a silent challenge to our understanding of the timeline of civilization. It sits there on the weathered skin of the gazelle hide parchment, waiting for us to reconcile the world we see with the world that was once known, a world of green forests where there is now only white silence, and of a sea that remembers everything, even when we have forgotten. To understand how such a fragment could survive the slow erosion of time, we must look to the place where it was found, a place where the air smells of old parchment and the dust of centuries settles like a soft blanket over the secrets of the world. In the year 1929, a German theologian named Gustav Deissmann was cataloguing non-Islamic items in the library of the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul. As he sifted through the remnants of the Sultan's vast collection, he pulled a scrap of gazelle skin from a stack of discarded documents. It was a moment of quiet gravity, the kind of accidental discovery that rearranges our understanding of the past. This map, painted in vibrant hues that had somehow resisted the fading touch of 500 years, was not merely a navigational tool. It was a ghost of a much larger world, a single leaf from a lost book of human knowledge. The Topkapi Palace itself stands as a silent sentinel at the crossroads of east and west, overlooking the shimmering waters where the Bosphorus meets the Golden Horn. For centuries, this was the heart of the Ottoman Empire, a fortress of marble and tile that served not just as a seat of power, but as a sanctuary for the intellectual spoils of the ancient world. While the libraries of Europe were often fractured by the chaos of the Middle Ages, the Ottoman sultans were cultivating a culture of preservation. They saw themselves as the rightful heirs to the legacies of Rome and Greece, and their court became a magnet for the scattered wisdom of the Mediterranean. Within the cool, shaded halls of the palace library, texts that had vanished from the Western consciousness were quietly tucked away, translated, studied, and kept safe from the fires of religious zealotry and the damp rot of neglect. We must imagine the Sultan's court as a place of intense curiosity, a gathering of cartographers, astronomers, and polymaths who looked at the horizon and saw not an edge, but a beginning. The Ottomans were a maritime power, and their survival depended on the accuracy of their charts, but their interest went deeper than mere military strategy. They were patrons of the global mind. They collected maps from every corner of the known earth, Arabic charts that traced the stars, Italian portolans that hugged the Mediterranean coasts, and perhaps, most intriguingly, ancient source maps that had been copied and recopied since the time of the Great Library of Alexandria. Piri Reis, the admiral who drafted our mysterious fragment, was a man of this world. He was a scholar sailor who explicitly stated in his own notes that he had consulted 20 different charts to create his masterpiece. He spoke of 8 maps of Ptolemy, 4 Portuguese maps, and 1 map of the Western lands, drawn by Christopher Columbus himself. But it is the ancient maps he mentions, the ones from the time of Alexander the Great, that send a shiver through the modern historian. Where did these maps come from? And what did they show that we have since forgotten? The Topkapi Library acted as a temporal bridge, allowing information from the deep past to leap across the chasm of the Dark Ages and land on the desk of a 16th century admiral. It is a sobering thought to realize that the survival of this information was a matter of pure chance. The palace has endured earthquakes, the rise and fall of dynasties, and the relentless march of modernity. That this specific piece of gazelle skin did not end up as kindling, or as a backing for a book binding is a miracle of historical serendipity. It sat in the darkness for hundreds of years, a silent witness to the changing world outside its stone walls, holding on to the image of a coastline that should not, by all accounts of modern science, have been visible to any human eye. As the years passed, the library became a repository for world secrets that the West was not yet ready to hear. The Ottomans had preserved the Greek works on geography and the Roman studies of the stars, keeping the flame of classical knowledge flickering, while the rest of the world was preoccupied with survival. This preservation was not merely an act of storage. It was a deliberate patronization of global studies. The Sultan's court was a place where a map of the world was a map of the divine order, and to understand the shape of the earth was to understand the mind of the Creator. In this atmosphere of reverence for the written word, the Piri Reis fragment was shielded from the wars that leveled the cities of Europe. It survived the great fire of Constantinople and the various sieges that shook the foundations of the empire. It remained hidden in the deep stacks, a dormant seed of a forgotten history, waiting for the right moment to be unearthed and questioned. When we consider the sheer volume of knowledge that has been lost to the flames of history, the burning of the Library of Alexandria, the destruction of the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, the survival of the Topkapi fragment feels even more profound. It suggests that there are pockets of the past that still remain, tucked away in the shadows of old buildings, waiting for someone to look at them with fresh eyes. The map asks us to consider the possibility that our ancestors knew more than we give them credit for, that they possessed a tradition of mapping that stretched back into the mists of deep time, long before the rise of the civilizations we recognize. Perhaps the ice-free Antarctica shown on the map was not a mistake or a fantasy, but a piece of data that had been passed down through the centuries, preserved by the scholars of the East until it could be rediscovered in a new age. The measured pace of the Topkapi's history reminds us that knowledge is a fragile thing. It requires a place to rest, a hand to protect it, and a mind to value it. The Sultan's court provided that sanctuary, allowing a fragment of a lost world to endure through 5 centuries of silence. And so, as we look at the weathered parchment today, we are not just looking at a map. We are looking at a survivor. We are looking at a message in a bottle, cast into the sea of time from a shore that has long since been buried under the ice. The mystery of how Piri Reis knew the shape of a continent hidden by glaciers remains unsolved, but the fact that he knew it at all is a testament to the enduring power of the library and the quiet, persistent survival of the truth. It sits there, in the soft light of the museum, inviting us to wonder what other secrets might still be hiding in the dust of the Topkapi, waiting for their turn to challenge everything we think we know about the story of our world. Imagine a single snowflake landing softly upon a vast white silence. In our modern understanding, this is the eternal state of the bottom of the world, a land defined by the absence of color, the absence of sound, and the absence of life. We are taught that Antarctica is a fortress of frost, a place where the wind howls across a desert of ice that has remained undisturbed for millions of years. Yet as we hold the image of the Piri Reis map in our mind's eye, a strange cognitive dissonance begins to take root. We are forced to reconcile 2 entirely different worlds, the lush, coastline-rich land depicted by ancient cartographers, and the brutal, frozen reality that history tells us was only first glimpsed by human eyes in the early 19th century. For hundreds of years, the southern reaches of our maps were filled with a phantom known as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land. Philosophers and dreamers imagined a continent of temperate forests and exotic beasts, a necessary weight to balance the world. But as the age of discovery pushed ships further into the biting spray of the Southern Ocean, the dream began to wither. It was not until the year 1820 that the veil was finally lifted. History records that a Russian expedition led by Fabian Gottlieb von Bellingshausen, and nearly simultaneously, an American sealer named Nathaniel Palmer finally laid eyes on the icy cliffs of the Antarctic Peninsula. They did not find the verdant paradise of the old maps. Instead, they found a wall of white, a crystalline barrier that seemed to warn all of humanity to turn back. This was the beginning of what we call the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, a period defined by a singular, desperate struggle against the elements. We think of men like Ernest Shackleton, whose ship, the Endurance, was crushed by the relentless pressure of the pack ice like a walnut in a vice. We think of the long, dark months his crew spent camped on drifting floes, listening to the ice groan and crack beneath them in the polar night. We think of Robert Falcon Scott, who reached the South Pole only to find the Norwegian flag of Roald Amundsen already fluttering in the wind, and who perished in the biting cold on his journey back, his journals recording the slow, methodical approach of the end. These men were giants of endurance, yet they were exploring a world that felt fundamentally alien, a place where the very air could freeze the lungs and the sun offered light without heat. As we reflect on these grueling expeditions, the mystery of the ancient maps only deepens. How could a civilization thousands of years ago have charted a coastline that Shackleton and Scott could barely navigate with the best technology of their time? The contrast is stark. On one hand, we have the historical record of 19th century explorers battling for every inch of frozen ground. On the other, we have the quiet, faded ink of the Piri Reis map, showing rivers and bays where today there is only a solid shelf of ice, hundreds of feet thick. In recent decades, our understanding of this frozen continent has shifted from the surface to the depths. Modern science has turned to ice core drilling and satellite imaging to peer through the white shroud. By plunging hollow drills deep into the heart of the ice sheet, sometimes 2 miles down, scientists have extracted long cylinders of ice that act as a vertical timeline of our planet's atmosphere. These cores contain tiny bubbles of ancient air, trapped like prehistoric ghosts, telling us of a time when the Earth's climate was vastly different. Through the study of stratigraphy, the layering of these ice deposits, we have learned that Antarctica was not always a wasteland. Millions of years ago, it was home to temperate rainforests, inhabited by dinosaurs and covered in ferns. But the timeline of mainstream geology remains rigid. It suggests that the ice sheet formed at least 34 million years ago and has remained largely stable ever since. This is where the mystery of the maps becomes truly unsettling. If the ice has been there for millions of years, then no human being should have been able to see the coastline beneath it. And yet, when we use modern satellite gravimetry to strip away the ice digitally, the subglacial topography, the actual shape of the land, bears a haunting resemblance to the features drawn by Piri Reis and Oronce Finé in the 16th century. We see the same jagged inlets, the same mountain ranges, and the same river valleys that are now buried under a weight of ice so heavy it has actually depressed the Earth's crust. We must ask ourselves if the ice is truly as old and as permanent as we believe. Some researchers have pointed toward the period known as the Younger Dryas, a sudden, violent cooling of the Earth that occurred roughly 12,800 years ago. This was a time of cataclysmic change, when the world was gripped by a sudden frost that lasted for over 1,000 years. Could it be that before this event, the Antarctic coastline was accessible? Could there have been a window in deep time, perhaps during a period of crustal displacement or a shift in the Earth's axis, when the southern continent was not yet a prisoner of the ice? As the years pass, the data from our satellites becomes more precise, revealing hidden lakes deep beneath the glaciers, like Lake Vostok, which has been sealed away from the world for eons. These subglacial environments are time capsules, potentially harboring life forms that have evolved in total darkness and isolation. They remind us that our knowledge of the continent is still in its infancy. We are standing on the surface of a giant, looking down through a frosted window, trying to discern the features of a face we once knew. The lush depictions on the ancient maps suggest a world that was interconnected in ways we are only beginning to grasp. They hint at a maritime civilization that possessed a level of cartographic skill that wouldn't be matched until the invention of the marine chronometer in the 18th century. If these maps are accurate, they imply that someone in the very deep past sailed the Southern Ocean when it was blue rather than white. They suggest that the unknown southern land was not a myth, but a memory, a fragment of geographical knowledge passed down through the centuries, surviving the rise and fall of empires, the burning of libraries, and the slow, inexorable creep of the glaciers. Consider the silence of the Antarctic interior, where the only sound is the rhythmic pulse of your own blood in your ears. It is a place that feels outside of time, yet beneath your feet the land remembers the touch of the sun. It remembers the flow of water and the roots of trees. The ice core samples tell us that the climate can change with terrifying speed, shifting from one state to another in a matter of decades. Perhaps the transition from the lush world of the maps to the frozen reality of the present was not a slow crawl over millions of years, but a sudden, traumatic shuttering of the world. As we gaze at the satellite images of the Queen Maud Land coastline and compare them to the parchment of the 16th century, the feeling of mystery is palpable. We are looking at a puzzle where the pieces don't quite fit, yet they refuse to be ignored. The grueling journeys of the 19th century explorers were a rediscovery of a lost world, a world that may have been known to a shadow civilization whose name has been scrubbed from the history books. The icy reality of Antarctica today is a testament to the power of nature to reclaim and conceal, but the maps remain, quiet, persistent witnesses to a different truth. They invite us to look past the white horizon and wonder what else lies buried in the deep time of our planet. As the wind sweeps across the Ross ice shelf, carrying the echoes of a forgotten age, we are reminded that the story of our world is far older and far more complex than the one we have written for ourselves. The ice may be thick and the cold may be bitter, but the truth has a way of waiting, enduring in the silence until we are ready to look beneath the surface. There is a specific kind of silence that exists in the heart of a library, a stillness that feels less like the absence of sound and more like the presence of weight. It is the weight of thousands of lives, bound in leather and ink, all waiting for a pair of eyes to bring them back to life. Within this quiet, the human mind begins to drift toward the edges of what is known. We find ourselves drawn to the gaps between the lines, the empty spaces on the parchment where the ink has faded, or where the cartographer simply stopped drawing. There is a profound, almost magnetic pull in the idea of forbidden history, a secret yearning to believe that the world we see is merely a thin veil draped over a much older, much stranger reality. This attraction to the unexplained is not a flaw in our logic, but rather a fundamental part of our psychology. We are a species of explorers, born from ancestors who looked at the dark silhouette of a distant mountain range and wondered what lay on the other side. When we look at the Piri Reis map, with its impossible coastlines and its hints of an ice-free southern continent, we are not just looking at a historical artifact. We are looking into a mirror that reflects our own desire for wonder. The map serves as a kind of Rorschach test for our collective understanding of the past. Where a strictly orthodox historian might see a series of errors, misinterpretations, or coincidences, the dreamer sees a message from a lost epoch. They see a map that shouldn't exist, describing a world that shouldn't have been known, and in that contradiction, they find a sense of liberation. There is a certain romanticism in the unexplored. In our modern age, where every square inch of the planet has been photographed by satellites and indexed by algorithms, the mystery of the Piri Reis map offers a rare sanctuary for the imagination. It suggests that despite our technological prowess, there are still shadows where the light of modern science has not yet reached. We find comfort in the possibility that the ancients knew things we have forgotten, that they moved across a world that was more connected, more vibrant, and more mysterious than the dry chronologies of our textbooks would suggest. The allure of the map's edges, those places where the ink bleeds into the unknown, reminds us that the map is not the territory. The story of humanity is not a straight line, but a vast, swirling ocean full of currents that pull us back toward the depths of deep time. Psychologically, the concept of a lost civilization serves as a powerful archetype. It speaks to a sense of mourning for a golden age that was taken from us by the slow grind of climate or the sudden violence of a cataclysm. When we consider the possibility of an advanced culture existing during the Pleistocene, the long epoch of ice and fire that ended roughly 11,000 years ago, we are engaging with a narrative of fall and recovery. We want to believe that we are not the first to achieve greatness, and perhaps that we will not be the last to leave a mark upon the world. The Piri Reis map becomes a bridge across the abyss of the Younger Dryas, that mysterious period of abrupt cooling and subsequent warming that reshaped the face of the earth. It offers a tantalizing hint that something survived the flood, something that remembered the shape of the land before the ice reclaimed it. As we ponder these possibilities, we must acknowledge the value of wonder in the pursuit of truth. While the rigors of archaeology, the careful study of stratigraphy, the layering of soil and stone, and the precision of radiocarbon dating provide the foundation of our knowledge, it is wonder that provides the spark. Without the willingness to ask, what if, we would never look for the anomalies that lead to new discoveries. The history of science is littered with settled truths that were eventually overturned by the persistent scratching at the edges of the map. In this sense, the mystery of the Antarctic coastline is not a distraction from historical truth, but a catalyst for it. It forces us to refine our methods, to look closer at the ice cores, and to listen more intently to the oral traditions of indigenous peoples who speak of lands that sank beneath the waves. The human mind thrives on the hunt for patterns. We see a curve in the ink that matches a subglacial valley, and our neurons fire with the thrill of recognition. It is a deeply satisfying feeling, the sense that we have solved a puzzle left behind by a ghost. And even if the match is not perfect, even if the skeptics are right and the map is merely a beautiful collage of misunderstood Portuguese charts, the search itself has merit. It keeps us humble. It reminds us that our current understanding of the world is a work in progress, a temporary sketch that will be revised by the generations that follow us. The weight of forgotten ages is heavy, yes, but it is also a source of gravity that keeps us grounded in our quest for meaning. Meanwhile, the ice of the south continues its slow, grinding journey toward the sea. It does not care for our maps or our theories. It simply exists, a massive frozen archive of the planet's breath. But as long as we continue to look at the Piri Reis map and feel that familiar stir of curiosity, the past is never truly dead. It lives in the questions we ask and the mysteries we refuse to let go of. We are drawn to the forbidden because it suggests that the world is larger than we were told, and that the silence of the past is not empty, but full of voices waiting for the right moment to be heard. As the years pass, and our technology allows us to see through the ice with ever greater clarity, we may find that the map was not a mistake at all, but a premonition, a reminder that in the grand theatre of deep time, the only constant is change, and the only limit is the reach of our own imagination. Consider the weight of a single piece of gazelle skin, cured and inked in the year 1513, surviving the rise and fall of empires, the damp of forgotten archives, and the slow, grinding gears of the industrial age. This fragment of vellum is more than just a chart of the seas. It has become a cornerstone of a nation's identity, a silent ambassador of the Ottoman Golden Age. In modern Turkey, the Piri Reis map is revered as a national treasure, a physical manifestation of a time when the horizon of human understanding was expanding at a breathless pace. Its image has even graced the currency of the Republic, appearing on the 10 million lira note and later the 5 lira note, passing through the hands of millions of people as they went about their daily lives, perhaps unaware that they carried a piece of the world's greatest mystery in their pockets. As the 20th century dawned and the world became smaller through the lens of satellite imagery and global telecommunications, the map did not fade into the background of academic curiosity. Instead, it underwent a metamorphosis, stepping out of the dusty halls of cartographic history and into the vibrant, often contentious world of modern alternative history. It became a beacon for those who sensed that the story of our species is far older and more complex than the textbooks suggest. Writers and researchers began to look at those strange southern coastlines with new eyes, wondering if the ink lines traced by Piri Reis were actually the echoes of a lost maritime civilization, a people who navigated the globe during the Younger Dryas, that enigmatic period of cooling and warming that occurred roughly 12,800 years ago. This era, characterized by rapid climate shifts and rising sea levels, serves as a dark curtain in the theatre of human history, and many believe the Piri Reis map is a glimpse at what lay behind it. The influence of this map on media and literature cannot be overstated. It has inspired countless documentaries, novels, and theories that challenge the standard timeline of human progress. It serves as the primary evidence for the idea of crustal displacement or ancient seafaring cultures that possessed a level of technological sophistication we are only now beginning to appreciate. In the quiet of the night, as one contemplates the precision required to map the longitudinal relationships shown on the vellum, the mind naturally wanders toward the possibility of a forgotten global network, a brotherhood of explorers who shared their knowledge across oceans that we once thought were impassable barriers. Meanwhile, in the quiet libraries and specialized laboratories of the world, a different kind of exploration continues. Cartographic historians and paleographers spend their lives hunched over high-resolution scans and infrared photographs, engaged in a painstaking effort to identify every single source Piri Reis might have used. They look at the style of the compass roses, the specific nomenclature of the Caribbean islands, and the calligraphy of the Ottoman script, trying to trace the genealogy of the information. Each name written on the map is a clue, a breadcrumb leading back through the centuries. Some researchers believe they can see the influence of lost Portuguese charts, while others find traces of ancient Greek maps that had been preserved in the great library of Alexandria before its tragic dissolution. They are looking for the source of sources, that mythical original map that might have started it all. This ongoing research is a testament to the map's enduring power. It is not a static object, but a living document that continues to yield secrets to those with the patience to listen. It represents the interconnectedness of human knowledge, a bridge built of parchment and ink that spans the divide between the medieval mind and the modern scientist. Piri Reis himself wrote that he compiled his work from 20 different charts, and in doing so, he created a synthesis of the known and the unknown. He took the fragmented observations of sailors, the mathematical theories of scholars, and perhaps the inherited wisdom of an age long past, weaving them into a single cohesive vision of the earth. When we look at the map today, we are seeing a snapshot of the human spirit's refusal to be confined by the immediate surroundings. It reminds us that knowledge is a relay race, where the baton is passed across generations, sometimes through fire, sometimes through war, and sometimes through the simple, miraculous survival of a piece of leather. The Piri Reis map stands as a symbol of this great, ongoing conversation, a reminder that we are all part of a larger story, one that stretches back into the mists of deep time and forward into a future where the ice may once again retreat to reveal the secrets we have forgotten. It invites us to consider that our ancestors were not just survivors, but observers, thinkers, and voyagers who looked at the stars and the sea and saw not just a void, but a path. As we drift towards sleep, we might imagine those ancient navigators standing on the decks of wooden ships, guided by maps we can only dream of, sailing toward a horizon that never truly ends. As the echoes of those ancient voyagers fade into the gentle rhythm of our own breathing, we find ourselves returning to the physical reality of the map itself, that solitary fragment of gazelle skin parchment that has survived 5 centuries of fire, war, and the slow, relentless erosion of time. It is, before it is anything else, a profound work of art. To look upon it is to see the hand of a master who did not merely record coordinates, but who poured the vibrant colours of the world into his ink. The rich ochres and deep indigos, the delicate illustrations of ships riding the swells, and the strange mythical creatures that roam the interior of unknown continents. All of it speaks to a time when a map was not just a tool for navigation, but a sacred portrait of the known and the unknown. There is a quiet grace in its lines, a confidence in its curves, that suggests Piri Reis was not merely guessing, but was transcribing a legacy of knowledge that felt as solid and as certain as the earth beneath his feet. And yet, we are left to balance the historical facts we can touch with the enduring mysteries that refuse to be silenced. We know the year it was made, 1513. We know the man who made it, a brilliant admiral of the Ottoman Empire. We know he drew from the charts of Christopher Columbus and the Portuguese explorers. But as we have seen, there are shadows on this parchment that do not fit the light of the 16th century. There are coastlines that seem to whisper of a world before the ice, of a time when the southern reaches were not a frozen wasteland, but a green and accessible shore. We are forced to exist in the space between what we are told is possible and what our eyes tell us is there. It is a comfortable space to inhabit as we drift towards sleep, a place where the rigid boundaries of modern science soften, and the vast, deep time of our planet becomes a fluid and living thing. Perhaps the greatest gift of the Piri Reis map is not the answers it provides, but the questions it leaves behind. It serves as a reminder that our history is not a closed book, but a series of scattered pages, many of which are still waiting to be found. We live on a planet that has seen the rise and fall of countless civilizations, many of which may have achieved heights of wisdom and skill that we are only beginning to imagine. The map is a bridge, a fragile, beautiful link between our world and a past that is much older, much stranger, and much more interconnected than we were ever taught. It suggests that the story of humanity is not a straight line of progress, but a long, winding journey through cycles of forgetting and remembering. As the night deepens, we can imagine the map being carefully rolled away, its colours muted in the dim light of the Topkapi Palace archives. It rests there in the quiet darkness, surrounded by the silence of centuries. The ships on its surface remain frozen in their mid-ocean transit. The kings on their thrones continue to gaze out over their painted kingdoms, and the mysterious coastline of the south remains tucked away, a secret kept in the folds of the vellum. The air in the archives is cool and still, smelling faintly of old paper and the dust of ages. Outside, the modern world continues its frantic pace, but here time has no meaning. The map waits, as it has always waited, for the next generation of seekers to look upon it with fresh eyes and wonder what else we have lost to the shadows of the past. We are all, in our own way, cartographers of the unknown. As we close our eyes and prepare to enter the world of dreams, we are setting sail on our own uncharted territories. The landscapes of our sleep are as vast and as mysterious as any continent depicted by Piri Reis. We travel across oceans of thought and through forests of memory, guided by an internal compass that we do not fully understand. And just as the ancient sailors looked to the stars to find their way home, we look to the quiet spaces within ourselves to find rest. The map of our own lives is still being drawn, its edges still blurred, its most distant shores still waiting to be explored. There is a profound peace in accepting that we do not know everything. In a world that demands certainty and immediate answers, the Piri Reis map invites us to embrace the mystery. It tells us that it is okay to wonder. It is okay to look at the horizon and see something that shouldn't be there. It reminds us that the earth is ancient beyond our comprehension, and that we are but brief visitors in its long, unfolding story. The ice will come and the ice will go. The mountains will rise and the seas will fall, and through it all, the spirit of discovery will remain. We are part of a lineage of explorers that stretches back into the mists of the pre-glacial past and forward into a future we cannot yet see. As you drift further away, let the image of the map fade into a soft golden blur. Feel the weight of the history it represents, a weight that is not heavy, but grounding, like a warm blanket on a cold night. The world is large and it is old, and it is full of wonders that are hidden just out of sight. You are safe in the knowledge that the mysteries will still be there when you wake, waiting for you to return to them with a rested mind. But for now there is only the stillness. There is only the quiet breath of the archives, the soft rustle of the parchment, and the endless, peaceful dark of the uncharted sea. The lines of the map dissolve into the darkness. The ink merges with the shadows, and the names of the islands and the bays become a soft, rhythmic hum in the back of the mind. Brazil, the Antilles, the great Southland, they are no longer places on a chart, but ideas, symbols of the infinite possibilities that exist in the world and in ourselves. The journey is over for today. The anchor has been dropped in a calm and sheltered harbour. The stars above are bright and steady, the same stars that Piri Reis watched from the deck of his ship, and the same stars that watched over the builders of the first cities 10,000 years ago. Rest now, and let yourself be carried by the gentle current of time. The map is tucked away. The secrets are safe. The history of the world is long, and there is plenty of time to uncover its truths. As you sink deeper into the softness of your bed, remember that you are a traveller in a universe that is far more beautiful and far more mysterious than any map could ever hope to show. The horizon is wide, the night is long, and the sea is at rest.